Hello, and welcome to the webinar, The Evolution of Data Security. What's next? My name is Eric Wallace with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. I have a few administrative details to share with you, and then I'll turn things over to our esteemed speaker. First, we would like to thank Rubrik for their partnership with today's event. They've been wonderful thought leadership partners to Argyle, and they're committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. Thank you again to Rubrik. We appreciate you joining us today. We welcome you to stay connected during today's event. For those of you who are active tweeters, please follow us on Twitter at Argyle Exec Forum, and be sure to follow Argyle on LinkedIn for special announcements. I also wanted to take a moment to touch on our content neutrality policy, which we've curated based on the feedback we've received over the years from our members. We've worked closely with our speaking faculty to ensure that you receive a set of balanced and neutral viewpoints during the session today, and we appreciate our members' support of this policy. Finally, and most importantly, we want to hear from you, so please submit all questions that come up during today's event into the chat section of the interface. Following the discussion, we've set aside time for our speakers to weigh in on your questions. Now, without further delay, I'll introduce our speaker, and then we'll begin our presentation. Today, we have Stephen Stone, head of Rubrik Zero Labs at Rubrik. Welcome, Stephen. Over to you.
My name is Steve Stone. I'm the head of Rubrik Zero Labs, as you can see there on the slide. We're going to really spend some time talking about our first Zero Labs report. But before I really begin, let me give you a quick background of myself. I began in the U.S. military. I was a special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, did that for a number of years, transitioned into the U.S. intelligence community, where I spent 5 years as a government civilian working on the cyber intelligence side of the house, and then spent the last 15 years or so in the private sector. I've been at multiple different companies, spent time at Mandiant, FireEye, and IBM, and I'm currently at Rubrik, where, as it says on the slide, I'm the head of Rubrik Zero Labs. And I'll speak about Zero Labs here a little more in just a second, just to give some context. But really what I want to do today is really speak about our first report that went out, the state of data security and the human impact of cybercrime. So before I really dive into what's inside this report, I'd like to kind of set the stage just really briefly about Zero Labs and what we wanted to do with our first report. I'll speak a little bit about the report methodology. We want to be upfront about where we've received our data set from, what the reception has been for that, and really it speaks to the level. And then we'll focus on the content itself. You can see there we'll have three main sections. We want to focus on the threat landscape that our organizations are operating inside of, the reality that these organizations deal with every single day, and then the way we think some resolution pieces are. So as we go through that, I'll speak to each of these areas. But really what I want to kind of start with, just as a quick scene setter, is what we do at Rubrik, and then inside Rubrik Zero Labs. I'll move to that pretty quickly. I just want to provide that for visibility so folks can understand where we're coming from and how we approach these topics. At Rubrik, we're on a mission to secure our clients' data wherever it lives. That focuses on both on-prem, cloud, and SaaS applications. And really what it focuses down to is we want to make sure that our organizations that we secure their data is secure, it's available in immutable air-gap backups. And then we really focus on these three aspects. Is the data resilient? Can it be accessed when it needs to be? And is it secure when it doesn't need to be accessed? Can an organization observe what is happening across their data? We think the ability to understand data is critical. And then what is the right remediation? How do we recover the right applications, data, files, and empower the right users? And so again, I just present this not as a sales pitch, just to provide visibility. We're very focused on data. You'll see that echo throughout this presentation. And really, we want to focus on data security. And then for myself specifically, I oversee Rubrik Zero Labs. We're the newest organization at Rubrik. I won't read this whole slide here, but really want to focus on a few key elements. The first is overall, our task is to deliver actionable, vendor-agnostic insights with the goal of reducing data security risks. So a few different pieces of that. First is, while we definitely focus on Rubrik core areas, we want to be able to speak to overall threat trends and things that we think will address those independent of our own technologies, our own offerings, our own feature sets. We want to focus on the larger risks across data security. The next is we really focus on three core pillars. The first is evil finding. We want to look for proactive and actionable decision points based on things that we see data returning from our clients, as well as large-scale trend analysis. And really here, it's about the right piece to the right decision maker so they can apply the right decision to their environments. Second, we want to reduce risk. We've approached this very pragmatically. We don't think you can prevent intrusions. We don't think you can prevent cyber attacks. We just really don't believe in silver bullets. However, that doesn't mean that we want to just walk away either and only focus on efficiency and scalability. We want to work to reduce the risk, which really means eliminating as many threat options as possible for different threat actors. And they want to be public about the way that we approach that. We want to be involved in public research, advocacy, and then other organizations that we partner with. And then additionally, the changes that we drive within Rubrik. How do we change our core data security technology? What tradecraft elements do we describe and advocate for within our own organization? And then how does that manifest with what we do? And then the third part, Rubrik Zero Labs is here to be involved in the larger data security and cybersecurity communities and really be that two-way interaction. We're there to represent Rubrik and the things that we think we have unique vantage points on to those communities, and also bring findings and thoughts from those communities back into Rubrik itself to better serve both our clients and our own organization internally. So you'll see us kind of pivot across these three areas. So with all that out of the way, now you can understand really how we're approaching different elements. And I really want to dive into this first report because I think we've got some really interesting things here. The first thing is, what do we want to do with this report? Really, having spent most of my career on the threat research side of the house, you spend your time talking about anomalies. What are changes from the baseline? What's different? What's unique? What's the new intrusion? What is that anomaly from that steady state? So knowing that was going to be the vast majority of where we focused at over time for Rubrik Zero Labs, we wanted to take the opportunity with our first report to take a step all the way back and look at and test our own assumptions about what we're seeing inside of data security. We wanted to really explore those realities and what are those impacts at a very, personal human level. And really, that's how we approach this. So we wanted to really take this opportunity to go after what does the threat landscape look like? How is this actually manifesting against our organizations? What are the impacts to our teams that are working to deal with these? And then also, each of us as individuals, what's the impact of these events for us? And we really wanted to focus on a mix of IT and security. We believe that's important for data security. We just don't see this as a one side of the house challenge. So we engaged over 1,600 IT and security leaders. Again, very intentional about the mix of those different shops. We say leaders, so just for some visibility into that, about half of the respondents were at the CISO and CIO level. The other half were at the VP or director level. And again, across a range of IT and security teams. And then we want to look at a global aspect. So we involved 3 different regions, Asia Pacific, EMEA, and the Americas. And you can see the 10 different countries that we chose to interact across. We know this doesn't represent everything in every organization, but we felt that this was the most center mass view that we could get. And we focused on organizations that had 500 or more employees. So that really, we want to present that as transparency into our data and by extension, our data bias here. So what we did was we started working with these entities and said, let's really hear what's happening on the front lines of data security. And let's then at that point, go through those findings and pull out what we think are the most important pieces. So we've done that with the main sections. And then the other part I think we did that was pretty interesting from my perspective was we took those findings and then we went to trusted key cybersecurity leaders. You can see who those are in the actual report itself. I won't go through all of them here in this presentation for the sake of time. But we took our findings to those entities and said, does this match your reality? Does this match what you're hearing from your organizations? And then most importantly, what are some real tried and true methods that we can use for resolutions on these issues? And we really heard back from those key cybersecurity leaders on 3 different strategies for how any organization can really go after these challenges. So pretty excited to dive into that as well. So with no further ado, let's kind of get into that. We'll talk about 3 distinct sections here today, starting with the landscape. And then what we have here is we'll go from the landscape into the realities this landscape presents to our organizations. And then we'll end with that resolution section that we spoke about. So when we talk about the landscape that our organizations are operating inside of, we heard 3 key trends emerge very quickly and remain very strong threads throughout the throughout the material. The first was cyber attacks are growing both in volume and impact. I don't think that will surprise anyone, but it was interesting to see how that manifested at senior leader levels. Second, known threats remain the largest challenge there, and I'll dive into what we mean by that. And then third, we're seeing organizations struggle with their own confidence in how to respond to these landscapes. So as we look at each of these in specific, really starting off with the most important question we wanted to ask is, what is the reality from the threat landscape? We've all seen reports about different numbers. We've all read different blogs that have talked about specific attacks or intrusions. We wanted to really start with this. Is this something that organizations, again, at that senior leader level are dealing with? And if so, how often and what types? And the first thing we heard back from a data point perspective was 98% of the organizations we engaged with dealt with at least one cyber attack at the senior leader level. So I don't want to parse this too finely, but I want to really dive into this for just a second. We're not saying, do these organizations have a SIM fire? Is there a detection engine that went off? This is about, are those CISOs, CIOs, VPs, and then directors having cyber events brought to their level? And we saw almost universally that was the case. 98% of the organizations had at least one event at that level. The second aspect was, when we looked at frequency, the average was about 47 cyber attacks brought to that senior leader level. So just shy of one per week. We think this is one of the things that really jumped out at us really from the beginning. This isn't a one-time thing. This isn't something that organizations are reading about that doesn't affect them. It's affecting almost every organization to the tune of about one time per week. Inside of those organizations, a little more than half of them suffered a data breach in the last year. And again, just below that, 51% dealt with a ransomware event at some level of success within their organization in the last year. So this really tells us in pretty uncertain terms, this is a real topic that's being affected and dealt with at every single one of these organizations for the most part. And then as we also looked at this, it wasn't just about the impacts from these intrusions on the events themselves. We're also seeing much more widespread media coverage. Again, I'm sure I'm not telling anyone anything they haven't seen. It's hard to open up the internet and not read about the newest breach or have our own organizations ask us what we think about something someone heard in a podcast or in a presentation or read about. That's also increasing the surface area and is also leading to these senior leaders having to address these topics. And then the other piece of this is, one thing that we're seeing more and more over time is, this isn't just the realm of a specific team or a handful of people inside IT and security. We're seeing impacts across more and more of an organization, which is making this more and more of a robust topic. So it's not just that there's more cyber events being brought up. It's not just that there's more cyber attacks. It's also not just that there's more of these events in the news. We're also seeing the ripple effects move much further across organizations. So when we look at this very first critical piece, we really do believe that there's a significant surge, again, in both the impact and the volume of these events. The next piece, as we dove down another level and what's inside these events, what type of threats are addressing this? And I think this is one of the challenges we face, particularly on the vendor side. We spend a lot of our bandwidth talking about the newest intrusion, the newest 0-day, the newest TTP. And I think that's appropriate. And there's a lot of reasons why that is the industry focus. But it's important that we take a step back and look at what's actually affecting organizations. And what we saw was just under 2/3 of events, 61% of them that organizations dealt with in the last year, dealt with a known vulnerability or a known method. So just about 2 out of 3 of these events, this is not a 0-day. This is not some exploit that no one's ever seen before. This is not some brand new cutting edge TTP. It's a well-known, well-established event. And then we looked at both looking back and also looking forward. And we had a couple of other data points that really augment this. The first is, when we looked back, about 1 out of 10 events that organizations dealt with last year still had not been able to adequately address the vulnerabilities from that event. So about 11% of the events, even though the organization had gone through those vulnerabilities or those openings were still there and still available for attackers. And then we look moving forward, we asked these same senior leaders, what are you most concerned about moving forward? What do you think is the largest challenge in the next year? And what we didn't hear was really sustained interest in 0 days. Only about 13% of organizations felt that 0-day exploits would be their largest threat in the coming year. So again, we don't want to downplay net new TTPs and 0 days. These are very important. We'll spend a lot of time on that. What we do want to highlight, though, is that is a part of the threat nestled amongst these well-known vulnerabilities, these well-known TTPs. And these are the events that by and large are producing impact at scale. And organizations are struggling to fully remediate and remove altogether from the board. So we found that pretty interesting. And the third piece we saw in the landscape is, this landscape is challenging organizations in their own confidence. We engage with these leaders about how is this manifesting inside your organization? What are you confident in? What are you struggling with? And what we heard right off the bat was 92% of organizations, so about 9 out of 10, are concerned in the next year they will not be able to maintain business continuity if they address a cyber attack. Couple things here. We're not talking about can you maintain everything? Can edge cases be addressed? We're talking about basic core business continuity. So that's the first piece I'd like to highlight here. And the second piece is this, while a broad discussion about cyber attacks, we're talking about it in a limited time frame, not forever, not the next 5 years. We're talking about basically 2023. How confident is your organization that it can maintain business continuity in 2023? And we heard back pretty strongly that this is a real concern for most organizations. And then the other side too, is we looked at some other metrics that speak to this confidence. One thing that we all have, no matter how senior we are, we all have bosses. And for most of the organizations that we interacted with, their bosses are C-suites and boards. So we asked, what's the confidence level you assess your board, your C-suite has in your organization's ability to recover critical data? So again, we're not talking about all things cyber. We're not talking about every edge case, every technology. We're kind of looking at that core piece of data security, which is if you have a cyber attack, how confident are your bosses that your organization can recover critical data? And about a third of these organizations, 33% of them, state that their board or C-suite has little to no confidence in their ability to recover critical data in light of one of these events. So again, this is another one of those numbers that really jumped out at us. That's not a small number. Another piece that we looked at was it's hard to talk threat landscape and impact and not discuss ransomware. It's top of mind for so many organizations and has been for a period of years. And so we engaged on two different topics. The first is, how likely are you to consider paying the ransom as an option? Not will you, but is this even an option you're going to discuss? And the second question is, how likely do you think your organization is to actually pay a ransom demand if you suffer one of these attacks in the next year? And what we heard was two pretty stark numbers. About 3 out of 4 organizations, 76% of them, as you can see there on the screen, would consider paying a ransom demand. It's at least on the table. So basically only 1 out of 4 organizations are saying, we're not even going to look at it. We're not going to address it. And the vast majority of organizations are at least going to consider it as an available option. Of those that are looking at considering it, 52% consider themselves extremely or very likely to pay that ransom demand. And again, these numbers really kind of jump off the page. I think we all feel pretty confident that no organization wants to pay a ransom demand. We all know there's a range of concerns around that, but for an additional range of factors, a little more than half of the organizations are fairly concerned that they're going to have to pay this ransom in the coming year. So we'll talk a little more about that later on in the presentation, but I think that's a number that I think should really grab our attention and show us there's quite a bit of work still to do in this space. As we shift gears into the reality, this was one of the things that we wanted to do with this report, was not just focus on the large scale. We now wanted to take it down a level and say, what are the impacts of this? You know, these realities are pretty stark. And what does that mean? Why are they this way? What's our confidence to understand the problem? And what are some of these impacts? So that'll be this next section that we talk about. And there's really 3 things that come out in these results. The first is leaders are struggling with essential resources. I don't think anyone's going to be surprised we talk about what those resource needs are, but we'll definitely dive into the top 5. The second, the overall weight of all of these events from all this cybercrime is producing significant wear and tear on our teams and our people. And we definitely want to spend some time there. I think that's one of those topics that while we're talking about it more as an industry, we're definitely late to need. I think we can really spend some time on that as an overall industry. And then third, this isn't because organizations don't understand the right strategies. They just have real challenges in fully fielding those strategies. And we'll talk about a couple of data points inside of that. So really starting with the essential resources, we asked, what are the biggest challenges to securing your organization from a cyber attack in the coming year? So again, not 5 years down the road, not 10 years down the road. What are the things that are preventing these teams from securing their own organizations? And what was really interesting is what wasn't listed. What wasn't listed is too high of a threat landscape, not an available set of technologies across the industry, not an understanding. These were not the challenges. The challenges, again, which I don't think will surprise anyone who's involved in this business, the first, far and away, was insufficient talent. there's not enough talent available, and there's not enough ability to bring that talent to bear on these topics. Second, it was a lack of cybersecurity tools and solutions that are in place or fully fielded. And again, at the risk of splitting this hair too finely, what we're talking about is not that they're not available, not that some vendor or some other organization has not built it. It's the ability to acquire it and then integrate it or fully field it. Any of us who have tried to launch a net new technology in our environment, this is not going to be a surprise to us. These are really difficult to do. Very few of these you can just buy and then all of a sudden they run and it's great. And then numbers 3, 4, and 5 all really go together. We saw a lack of prioritization around budget for data security, lack of overall prioritization from that same set of bosses, the C-level and the board, and then competing priorities across a number of teams about how do you secure an organization? What are the most important and most impactful pieces? So really, I think what this boils down to, and again, this I think is something that we've all been pretty aware of, is its lack of talent, its lack of ability to field all the right technologies, and then it's a struggle to get after prioritization and receiving resourcing for those prioritizations. The last thing I'd say on this topic is, while this is an organizational issue for every single entity, I have yet to meet an organization, whether it's government, Fortune 100, that has a significant amount of resources that does not feel these are issues. These are the exact same issues we're seeing, but often in a more profound sense at smaller organizations. Every entity on the internet has to face the exact same threat landscape. What's really stark in the difference is the amount of available resources to tackle this. There are significant shortcomings. There's a number of organizations that don't have an IT team, that don't have a security team, that don't have access at all to budget for cybersecurity tools and solutions, little less fully field those. So we think it's really important to note there really is a component of cyber haves and cyber have-nots on this. And we think that's important. And we've heard that very much come through from these organizations. The second issue is the cumulative effect of the challenges and the threat landscape are really placing a significant toll on both our teams and also our people. And so we broke that question into two. We said, what you can see there in the main part of the box and the white part of the screen, for those organizations that dealt with a cyber attack in the last year, again, 98% of them, did they have impacts? And if they did, what were those impacts? And what we heard back is it's almost nearly universal that there was a negative impact in the last year from these cyber events. 96% of the organizations assessed that they had one of these negative impacts. When we look at these negative impacts, there's two things I'd definitely love to call out. The first is what was the smallest, which is that 5%, the negative impact of stock. I think this is important because I think if we're all being really honest, if we all take our truth serum today, this is what we all do. We read about a breach in the news, we pivot over to the stock ticker of that affected company if they're public, and we see how their stock is doing. I know I do it. I don't want to speak for everybody, but I've seen a lot of you do it too. So I think as we look at that, that's a natural reaction, but we're hearing very clearly from these organizations, that's rarely the actual impact. Less than 5% of those organizations had a negative impact to their stock. What we do see on the other end is we have these three sets of what I call the 40s. 42% of these organizations lost customers based on a breach. And right behind that was a loss of revenue. So 42% loss of customer, at least one, 40% lost revenue based on these cyber attacks. And right between the middle of that at 41% was assessed negative press or reputational damage from these events. Again, these are pretty stark numbers when we talk about impacts of organization. We all know how hard it is to earn clients and earn their trust. And we're seeing that those are usually the most impacted things in these events. The other piece that, at least for me personally, really surprised me was 36% of organizations dealt with a leadership change based on these events or the response for them. 36% had a leadership change that they were forced to deal with based on these events. That's a really tough thing for an organization to endure, especially on the other side of one of these events. We then address what you see in the green box. We asked in essence that exact same question. What is there an impact to us as individuals? So instead of the team, us as actual people. And what we saw was the exact same number. 96% of the individuals assessed that they went through a significant emotional or psychological impact in the last year from these cyber attacks. So again, not hypothetical. This is affecting us in our daily lives. And you can see there the three most prevalent impacts. Half of individuals have increased anxiety in their daily role. Basically, the stress is increasing in their jobs. Just below that, we saw 43% worry about their job security. And just underneath that was a loss of trust among colleagues. And then about a third of respondents state that they're having trouble sleeping or they're just losing sleep based on these cyber attacks. And again, this isn't just a one-time thing. If we go back to dealing with 47 of these events on average in the last year, it's pretty easy to see why we're feeling these impacts to our teams and to our people. And then the third thing we heard about reality is, here's what it isn't. The reality is not that organizations don't understand the right strategies. That's just not the issue that we're facing. It really is much more about struggling to fully execute those security strategies for a range of reasons. And we wanted to pick out a couple of things that we think demonstrate that. Again, starting with the white box in the middle, we see virtually universal agreement that IT and security operations teams have to work hand in hand to really deal with these events. That's the right way for resiliency and proactive response, and then actually being in these breaches. I, again, have yet to meet a senior leader that doesn't agree with that. When we actually asked about the reality of that, though, we saw 31% of organizations state that their teams with IT and security ops are either somewhat or not at all aligned on these topics. So that tells us that we still are not finding effective ways to bring all these teams together at scale. And then we looked at public and private partnerships. This is, again, a topic that's not new to the industry. We've talked about it for a long time, and we thought that would be a good way to gauge how are we doing with our own strategies. And what you see is the top two numbers deal with how do we assess these strategies. Almost 9 out of 10, 89% of entities believe that public and private partnerships are beneficial to responding to cyber attacks. And 2/3 of organizations, 64%, consider them very or extremely beneficial. So that's great. 2 out of 3 of us think these things are critically important, and 9 out of 10 of us think these things are beneficial. We now then ask the question of, are we actually doing this? How many of us are engaged in these partnerships? And we saw a pretty significant delta there. It dropped to about 44% of organizations are involved in at least one partnership. That can be working with a respective government. That could be working with one of the ISACs. That could be an industry partner, whatever that is. But we're seeing that 66% of organizations are not involved in any form of partnership in this topic. So I think that really tells us that we want to do these things, and we're struggling to really kind of get that across the line. So we then look at, how do we respond to all these things? What do we do here? We don't want to just, especially from a Rubrik Zero Labs perspective, we want to go back to that reducing risk. We don't want to just talk about there's risk out there, there's threat out there. So we took these results and we went to a handful of trusted senior cybersecurity leaders, both inside Rubrik and external to Rubrik, and said, what do we think we can do here? What do we think are some credible solutions and strategies that any organization can apply as they want to go after these topics? And we really came across 3 that we believe are tried and true and beneficial for any organization. The first is, again, let's focus on the data set that we have. We're talking about senior leaders, directors, VPs, CIOs, and CISOs. Those same leaders need to create the ability to have readiness for weekly intrusions. Last year, that data set, that set of individuals had to deal with almost an attack a week. There is almost no metric or trend that thinks that the attacks will go down next year. Virtually every organization that looks at this space believes there will be more cyber events, there'll be more threats year over year. So if we're talking about 47 last year, let's just round up and say 1 per week. These senior leaders need to have the ability and the bandwidth to deal with one of these events every single week. This shouldn't be a nights and weekends task. This shouldn't surprise us. We know these things are coming. And we think it's important to spread that workload across a variety of teams and roles to bring in more capacity. And then the other part of this is, again, if we talk about the sheer numbers, organizations should not plan to deal with a breach and have a capacity to do this one time. We've got to respond with this breach over breach, intrusion over intrusion. So with that mindset, we also need capacity to understand and assess what we're doing and make the next breach better. We need the additional capacity for lessons learned and the ability to actually field and implement the improvements. Otherwise, it's going to be kind of the wheel that we can't get off of, and we'll just keep doing the same things again and again and again. So really, in summary, these senior leaders need the capacity to work the events and an additional capacity to learn from these events and field improvements to be better prepared for the next breach, because we assess the next breach attempt is coming. Second, We think that we can ask more of our data. And really kind of when we talk about this, often when we talk about intrusions or intrusion attempts, we tend to view data as the end goal. And it is, that's appropriate. Almost all intrusion efforts at some point come down to either denying data or accessing data and then doing something with that. The problem, though, is when we only think about data as the victim, we lose its ability to work as an enabler. As we ask more of our data in our organizations, we can really understand better ways to respond and better ways to be prepared for the next breach. The first thing we think is it's important to think about data expansion. Virtually every organization has more data today than it did yesterday, and will likely have more data tomorrow than they did today. We've also seen time and again that data tends to creep around environments. We talk about environmental creep, architecture creep. Data does the exact same thing. And so we've got to be prepared for those and anticipate and understand that. The second is if we understand where our data is and we understand how we use our data and the criticality of it, we can then accelerate our event response and also reduce impact. We don't need to worry about every single data element to the same level. That's not practical. It's not pragmatic. If we understand these things and then focus on the right levels of security, the right levels of resiliency, we can now prioritize where we spend our budget, where we spend our resources, and then particularly in these crisis moments, we can enable better decision-making around that. So we really think asking more of the data is a critical question to that. And we think will really empower a number of things, particularly in a resiliency and a prioritization standpoint. And then the last issue that we brought up as a resolution point, and we've alluded to this a couple of times throughout, so I think it will be an obvious answer here, is it's important that this not be just an IT and a security team problem. We have to make this a whole of organization challenge and share that cyber risk across an entire organization. This brings more resources to bear and more capability and helps the right organization solve the right part of the problem. The flip side of that is if we want to share risk, we have to share insights. And ideally, we want that insight to be consistent and timely across organizations. If we have one element of an organization making decisions based off one data set and a different element working in a different direction for what they think is going on based on a different data set or a lack of visibility, we're not going to have the right solution. So we want to implement shared visibility to these intrusions and these intrusion events and how we want to respond to them. We want to expand that event response to involve every capability within our organization. It's easy to think about how will the IR team be involved? How will the SecOps team be involved? But we should be asking, how will legal be involved? How will comms be involved? What's the role of our HR department? These are critical capabilities with lots of resources that we can bring to bear. And then we've really got to look for tools and processes that bring these teams together. We need to be able to say and really prioritize those elements that allow us to do that. And then by extension, let's deprioritize single-use, single-team functionality unless it's absolutely necessary. And then ultimately, it's not about one set of decisions and one piece of risk. It's about enabling the right decision maker for the right task and splitting the risk up amongst that, just like we do in every other non-cyber topic. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find an industry that hasn't figured this out for their core features. We look at the automotive industry and how they approach safety. There's not just an issue with the safety team. We look at oil and gas and how they do delivery. That's not just a delivery team problem. And you could go on and on through different industries. We think those lessons learned that we've seen over and over again and have really borne out their success, we need to apply that same mindset here and share cyber risk and bring these capabilities to bear. And that will help us get through these challenges much quicker in a much more resilient manner. So with that, I know we went through this fairly quickly, but we wanted to give a quick overview. There's a lot more details inside that data report, which will be available via link for those that are interested. But I'd be real interested in any questions from the audience that we have here.
Thank you, Stephen, for that insightful presentation. So we'd like to open up for audience Q&A and encourage attendees to continue to submit questions using the chat feature. So let's jump right in and address some of the questions that were submitted. Okay, so our first question, I believe this one came in the early minutes. They asked, did the methodology include the PRC? So do you recall? Okay.
Yeah, great question. It did not include the PRC, and we did that intentionally. The PRC comes with a fairly unique set of challenges based on how the PRC is governed and some of the technical ramifications of that. So there was just a lot of uniqueness and one-offs that we just made an intentional decision to not involve the PRC as we were looking at, what are some of these global trends.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So our next question is a big one, so bear with me here. So Stephen, could you touch upon audio and image stenography used for unauthorized data exfiltration, as well as how we protect ourselves when using OCR scanning and direction step, where the data exfiltration exploits weaknesses in OCR detection in ML-based directors by using such thing as mirror text, flip text, etc., to try to defeat computer vision-based detection solutions? I've yet to see anything that is effective when presented with those types of threats. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so a few different thoughts on that. We look at steganography, in particular Steg C2, both with audio and image. Those have been around for quite a while. Those are not new threats. And I think there's a lot of variety inside those. I think the biggest thing I would say is, and I think this goes back to prioritization and understanding our data and our environments. You could absolutely beat yourself silly trying to prevent proactively every ability to use audio or imagery steg. Again, even just the C2 aspect. There's so many challenges there. Or we could apply that same level of resourcing in what's left and right. You can't do steg work all on its own. It just doesn't work that way. So if we understand how an attack lifecycle works, and we understand, all right, it's going to take us significant effort to go after these things. I'm not saying we should ignore those. I'm definitely not saying that. But we can probably produce impacts on other areas and then focus around, again, like the question mentions exfil. Let's focus on where is our data at? How do we prevent exfiltration? How do we see what's exfiltration? If we look at how most exfil works in intrusions, especially with actors that are using steg, there's a pretty strong history of staging exfil, moving it across an environment, and then taking it out at distinct increments. That is much more solvable than going for some of these other things. So I think that's how we would recommend looking at it. And again, understanding we're shooting right past the core part of it. Exfil is all about a threat actor wants something out of your environment. They want your data. Well, we can probably be pretty successful in limiting the kinds of data that are even available to these kinds of events. And then also, how does that data traverse? Who is accessing it? How is it being accessed? And then we can look for those anomalies pretty cleanly, and then also have some pretty well sought out prevention at scale around that.
Thank you, Stephen. That was excellent. So our next question is, we are struggling to recover from a destructive cyber attack. Do you have any advice for us?
That's a broad question. So without knowing any additional details, man, that's really tough to get into. But I think some of the general takeaways for dealing with a destructive cyber attack is, first thing is, don't make an assumption the attack's over. We see that again and again and again. It's not a one-time thing. We've seen more organizations than I can count will successfully deal with a destructive cyber attack, but will make bad assumptions about, does the actor still maintain access? Are there other risks? And then all of a sudden they're right back in it, and it becomes a vicious cycle. So I would really recommend taking a step back and saying, how do we make sure we have our arms around this, and then get into remediation efforts? Second thing I would say is, when we look at destructive cyber attacks, we tend to approach those with, and I don't want to imply that this is what the question asker is doing. Again, I just don't have enough information there. Typically, it's a matter of, let's treat like a DR scenario, a disaster recovery scenario. We're under attack, data's been destroyed, let's bring everything back up. That's rarely what's needed. So I would really focus on what are the things you absolutely need, and then what's required to do that. Is there a certain system that has certain data that you need? Let's focus on that. Is that system reliant on AD? If it is, you got to get AD up first. So I would recommend that. And then the third thing I would say is, back to one of those recommendations we just talked about, bring in every available resource to understand the problem and to look for all the available solutions. There are different things that can stay down for significant periods of time, even if they're not desirable. And there's other things that can't. So let's try to understand some of those and work through that. And I apologize for the general answers. Without more details on this specific event, it'd be hard to be much more specific.
Thank you, Stephen. That was excellent. So let's jump over to let's see, number 6. There were a few high-profile vulnerabilities recently and commonly used embedded libraries recently. Do vulnerabilities of this type have a higher impact due to the range of items to remediate? How much effort was being spent to remediate these, even if the company wasn't attacked or even sure that it was vulnerable?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the big lessons out of 2022, right? These fairly large vulnerabilities really dominate the landscape. Let's just look at Log4Shell. We're at effectively the 1-year anniversary of Log4j, and while the patch is now out and the remediation is available, I'll give my own assessment, but I don't think it's going to be out of line with any major player that's looking at the threat landscape. Those intrusions are here forever. I don't know a single organization that would assess now that the patch for Log4j is available, everything will get patched. There's too much there. So while we can have some of this risk reduced, there's a ton that's not. So we're going to really have to kind of go through that and focus on these long form things. OpenSSL is another one. So what I would say again is, and again, I hate to be overly simplistic, but let's take a step back here. Let's even look at vulnerabilities for this year. We already know that 2021 was the highest record ever for reported vulnerabilities for CVEs. It was something like 20,452, something like that. We've already surpassed that record this year. We're already almost at 22,000 reported vulnerabilities this year. So we already know that we're in a record year and we're going to blow away the previous record. So that trend is up. The challenge is, I don't know any organization that can close all those vulnerabilities. That's difficult work. We make it sound very easy and very fundamental, but it's not. It's a real challenge. And anyone that's tried to update their Exchange servers or any other piece of technology knows what I'm talking about. So I think it comes down to prioritization. And I think it comes down to, if we're going to be resilient in our operations, we cannot just deal with whatever is out there. We have to remove legacy architecture and just not worry about it anymore. We do that by removing it from our environment. We have to understand where our data lives and have some things and some parts of our environment that will be 100% patched from vulnerabilities and have strong vulnerability management, because that's what that data requires. And then other stuff that's not. I mean, let's just all be honest here. If we talk about an attacker stealing our company's source code versus our company's 2020 marketing materials, we're going to react very differently to those events. By understanding that and looking at that programmatically before we're in these events, along with looking how we do vulnerability and vulnerability management, we're going to be much, much more effective. And that's where I think we're going to see these things come together.
Thank you very much. Okay, our next question. What's the biggest mistake you've seen companies make in attempting to lower their risk of cybersecurity attack? And how do they get past these?
Great question. I think the biggest mistake I have seen companies make is they don't test their decision making. And what I mean by that is they think they can apply a decision and they have no idea that they actually cannot. Or conversely, they don't understand that there's other things that they can do. And I'll give a couple of examples. We were working with one organization that's like, okay, we're dealing with a data destruction attack. We just want to not deal with this and bring our data back up. So let's do that. Well, your organization didn't enable those tools. So you don't get that. You don't get to make that decision. You think you do. Someone's told you that you do, but you've never actually tested it. Or you think, oh yeah, I can recover all this data, but you haven't looked at the applications and the systems. Well, now you can't. You've got a series of dependencies that have not been thought out. So while you're trying to lower your risk and you might have solved part of it, you've not solved the necessary components and really stepped through that. So I think that's one thing. I think the other piece is organizations struggle to get into the granular sides of this, and that often forces them into major muscle movements. And I'll give an example where an organization actually had more capability than they realized. We were recently going through an organization that was dealing with a large-scale ransomware event, and they were able to recover their data. And their decision was going to be, let's just go back 30 days and restore everything, and we'll just suffer the impact of losing the last 30 days of data, but we're going to be back online and running very, very quickly. We had some additional features, and I won't turn this into a product push, so I apologize if it comes across that way. But we were able to use our technology and say, wait, hold on a second. Let's actually apply some of the findings from the threat research that this organization did They'd done all that hard work. Let's run that against the data backups before we recover anything. And what we found out was, of all the affected architecture, almost all of it, 90%, let's just roll it back 6 hours and restore that. And you're going to lose 6 hours of data. And there was 10% where the attacker was in that environment for 6 days. Well, sorry, we can't go back 6 hours. We have to go back 7 days to fully restore those systems. But that's much better than 30 days. And that's much better than, 90% of the environment came back with only a 6-hour loss. Another 10% came back with less than a week's worth of data loss. And again, it was just about, well, that sounds like kind of a, that's the thing the nerds do, is dive down into the features. That's about decision-making for the C-suite. The C-suite did not understand they could ask those questions because it was assessed that they weren't technically smart enough. Well, they probably weren't to use the UI and move across the environment, but they're probably smart enough to understand how these processes work. And there's better enablement that could have been done there. And once we did that, they had a much lower risk they had to accept and get right back into their operations very, very quickly. So I think that's what we really see is understanding, can you actually apply the decisions that you want to make to your environment? And are you asking the environment the right questions before you enact those decisions?
Thank you. That was excellent. Okay, so our next question, what are your thoughts on how do you think cybercrime is going to evolve over the next couple of years? And for that matter, cybersecurity, is it keeping pace?
Oh man, another great question. We actually just put out our predictions piece on what we think the next couple of years holds. So off the top of my head, I'll try to see how much of that I can remember. For the context of cybercrime, one specific thing I think that we'll see is, we talk about ransomware. I think there'll be less focus on the encryption event as the ransom piece and more focus on data destruction and data leakage. And what I mean by that is, the industry has gotten much better at recovering data. We've seen attackers respond to that. And also doing encryption and decryption at scale is challenging. It's much easier to wipe data and delete it or exfiltrate it and then say, we deleted off all your data and now you can pay us to get it back, or we're gonna, leak it all online. I think that's a much more profound challenge and is much easier to monetize for most threat actors. And we're already seeing that. So that's not really a super bold prediction, but I think we're gonna see a really hard pivot that way. So I think ransomware will continue, but I think what is actually getting ransomed, what the exact extortion attempts are for, is gonna change pretty demonstrably in the next year to two. Another trend I think we'll see is the bar for high-end intrusions is getting lower and lower, and I think we're going to see that speed up. There's a number of off-the-shelf tools that are built for valid reasons that are widely available for attackers, and we're seeing them used all over in intrusions, and that trend is demonstrably going up. We're seeing in criminal forums and the dark web, the entire as-a-service model that we've learned in the industry, the attackers are doing the same thing. Ransomware as a service is a topic we talk about all the time, and we weren't talking about in the past. We're seeing access as a service. There's a number of these things. So if anything, the bad actors have learned from the good actors that this as a service model is pretty handy. And that is lowering the threshold for a number of actors to get into the game. You don't have to be able to do everything anymore. You basically got to be able to pay for a couple of things and then stitch it all together. And I think that's going to produce some really profound impacts in the next couple of years. On the other side of the house, on how we're keeping pace, I think we're going to see the maturation of a lot of these policy changes and regulations and guidance, both from governments and industries, really manifest. Those, again, didn't start this year, but I think they're really starting to take hold. GDPR is not new to anyone anymore, but just look at the legislation that's passed in the US alone in 2022. There's a number of things that I think are going to bear real fruit. I think they're going to produce some significant changes as these whole of government levers are being switched. And we're going to feel that. The flip side of that is, and I'll go back to one of the things we had in our slides here, there's a cyber haves and have-nots. And as much as I personally, as an analyst, believe these things are the right answer, oh, by the way, so does Rubrik. We're fully supportive of these whole of government and industry approaches. That puts a lot of strain on these smaller organizations. That's a thing that large organizations and governments struggle with. So if we have all these organizations that struggle with accomplishing this technically, and now we put a bunch of regulatory and policy guidance and requirements on top of that, That's tough to do when you don't have staffs and trained personnel and built out workflow and process. So I think that that's going to produce a lot of positive and also drive that cyber's have and have not gap farther apart, which I think is something we should be concerned about and worried about. And then the last prediction I'd say is, I think we're going to continue to see, back to the earlier question about Log4j and OpenSSL, these aren't going away. So we're going to continue to see the increase of new O-days and new exploits, but these very large ones are going to continue and they're going to keep going. And so that surface area that's available for attacks is going to increase, I think, demonstrably in the next year or two, not decrease, which is going to really force us to look for much more fundamental solutions versus individual patches and closing individual gaps. We're going to have to go after how we do this at scale in a much more systemic way. Otherwise, we're just never going to get ahead.
Thank you. That was a wonderful insight. Okay. So now, finally, can you recommend a good book, a good article, good resources about cybersecurity for us?
Oh man, another great question. Ending with another tough one. There's a lot out there. There's if you want to dive in the technical aspect, Practical Malware Analysis has been out for a long time. It's a great one. The D4 Guide to Incident Response is another great one. But I think what I really personally enjoy is we're starting to see non-technical and other augmenting publications come out. One I was just personally reading this morning was Corvus. Corvus, the insurance organization, is putting out their highlights so far for this year. And it talks about how much they're paying out for ransomware and how much they're paying out for BEC events. That's fascinating reading. I would recommend to anybody. You look at Nicole Perloff has a great book out on They Tell Me This Is How the World Ends and what cyber war and wars in plural looks like and how they stack up. There's another great one called Tracers in the Dark, which just came out that talks a lot about how whole ecosystems and how threat actors over time are operating. So what I would really recommend is don't find just one niche. Don't just go technical or non-technical book or website. There's so many good things to read out there now. The more varied we are in that, I think the more intelligent we'll be on these topics.
Thank you, Stephen. That's all we have for questions. And so do you have any final thoughts before we close it?
I would just end it with this. We really appreciate everyone's time. And I hope that what we talked about here matches the realities our people on this call are hearing. This should be the things that if you were to come to us and say, yeah, that largely is what we're encountering, that's what our hope is. Or if it doesn't, we'd love to hear that. We'd love to hear where we're tracking off base or where you're seeing a different reality. So please feel free to read that report and reach out to us. We'd love to engage with organizations on this topic. And thank you for your time, everyone.
Thank you, Stephen, for that insightful session. This concludes today's webinar, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this fantastic virtual event. And thank you again to our partner, Rubrik, and enjoy the rest of your day.